For joining us in Singapore, Dr. Paul Krugman, always a pleasure to have you on CNBC India. Thanks very much for joining us. Let me start by asking you about the global economic picture, and do you believe that it's going to get worse before it starts to get better?
I think it's troubling. I don't think we're looking at anything, if your standard is 2008, it's nothing like that. But there's pretty clear signs of a slowdown in all of the major economies. Probably not
a recession?
Not a recession in the U.S., maybe one in Europe, not one in China, but it does look as if uncertainty about trade policy and maybe uncertainty about policy in general is having a pretty serious drag on capital expenditure, and it's not great.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the tariff tussle that's currently on between the U.S. and China, and every time the stock markets fall a couple of hundred points, there seems to be room for negotiation, and then you go right back. So how are you reading where things currently stand and what the future looks like for these trade talks?
I think that every time the stock market does an uptick after this, that's the triumph of hope over experience. I mean, there's no sign that there's any real negotiation. There's really no indication that there's any clear basis for negotiation. It's not at all clear exactly what Trump wants. I think he wants the bilateral imbalance to disappear, and that's not something that any plausible Chinese policy can deliver. So I don't know. I think people keep on hoping something's going to come, but look, we know that Trump actually, basically made up a call from the Chinese to try and goose the stock market a few weeks back. So, no, this is the fundamentals are that the trade war is on and it's intensifying.
So, what will be the casualties of this trade war intensification, and also what could be the potential opportunities for a country like India? And there's a lot of conversation around the fact that, as President Trump says, move supply chains out of China. Could that benefit a country like India?
Probably, India is probably not top of the list here as an obvious case. I mean, I think the things you want to think about are which countries are relatively well suited to take over some of what China does. India is not a major manufacturing export. It's kind of unique, and having gone into service exports, it's much more obvious to think of shifting production to Vietnam, or even in cases like apparel to Bangladesh. So I'm not sure that India is a likely beneficiary. And of course, there's a little bit of a U.S.-India trade conflict that's taking place as well. So the other thing that's important about the trade war is that the direct impact on exports, on imports, on supply chains is just part of the story. The uncertainty that this thing is creating is clearly having a chilling effect on capital expenditures. Businesses don't know which way to jump. They don't know whether there will be more tariffs, or maybe maybe there really will be a resolution of the disputes, and you don't want to commit yourself either way. So that's something that doesn't benefit anyone.
Oh, but what is the way out of this? Or are we just going to have to continue to live with this uncertainty? Because, who's going to set the rules of engagement in this battle?
Well, the trouble is, certainly on the U.S. side, the trouble is, it turns out that the U.S. trade policy system is one that gives enormous discretion to the president. The executive branch can basically do whatever it wants. It's supposed to have certain valid criteria for imposing tariffs, but if they're willing to say they can do anything in the name of national security, and so as long as you have Trump who wants to do this stuff, no one can stop him.
And do you believe that it's going to get worse, especially on the U.S. side, as we get closer to the election?
I think so, because, you might imagine that since it doesn't seem to be actually delivering, since it seems to be slowing growth instead of accelerating it, that Trump would say, okay, maybe I'm on the wrong course here, and let's do a course correction. But all indications are that he's not that kind of guy, that he will actually just double down in an attempt to make it, to prove that he was right. And so just on terms of his own personality, I don't think we're looking at a resolution. And it's also not clear, I mean, if you like, part of the whole thing is the frustration of a superpower in relative decline, not absolute, but relative decline, at the rise of a rival power, and there's nothing the Chinese can do that would satisfy that. So I think this gets worse. Maybe it gets a little bit better after the next U.S. election, but for the time being, I don't see any turnaround.
Clearly, the escalation of this tariff battle between U.S. and China would perhaps be the number one risk to global growth. What would the other key elements be?
Well, Europe has a real problem of, I think, basically fundamental weakness. There's no crisis in Europe, although we could get one. I mean, Italy can blow up at any time, but its demand is so weak, and Europe has no effective fiscal policy. They've been entirely reliant on this extreme low interest rate policy on the part of the ECB, which has clearly reached its limits. So I think Europe is a clear. It's not that something terrible is happening, but that just you have no shock absorbers. So anything can really derail European growth. And then China has shown amazing resilience, willingness to do what it takes, but the Chinese economy is deeply unbalanced. The internal debt issues are huge, so shadow banking. So China, predicting a Chinese crisis has been a loser's game, because I've been guilty of it too. You've spent many years in saying this is unsustainable,
and yet they continue.
And yet they continue. But although we do have something in economics we call Stein's law. If something cannot go on forever, it will stop. So maybe at some point it will happen. But right now, it doesn't seem to be China. But I think after the trade war, the European slowdown and the risks of a European recession is probably next in line.
You talked about interest rates and the fact that we continue to be in an era of extremely low interest rates and an accommodative monetary policy. How are you viewing this current escalation of the battle between President Trump and the Fed, and what that could potentially mean for central banks around the world?
Well, Trump is he's on very weak moral ground here. I mean, he's busy yelling at the Fed, and the fact is that long-term interest rates, which are the ones that matter for investment, have come way down, and all across the term structure, interest rates are much lower than the White House itself predicted last year in its very optimistic forecast about the economy. So the attempt to blame the Fed really doesn't hold up. But if the economy is weakening, then the Fed really has no option except to try to provide some stimulus. I think maybe more broadly, central bank independence has not been. That's a relatively recent development. It used to be that we expected that
to be a given.
No, it wasn't always the case. I mean, it used to be that the Bank of England was simply a branch of HM Treasury, and that the Federal Reserve really was not an independent policymaking institution. And maybe, I mean, there are few people worse positioned to make the case against independent central banks than Donald Trump. But still, you wonder whether central bank independence is maybe an idea that's kind of reaching its sell-by date.
You believe that?
Well, I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, central bankers have actually let's put it this way, central banks may have too much credibility. We have a situation now in an economy with persistent weakness, and which is what we have in Europe and perhaps in the United States. Knowing that the central bank is in the hands of men who will never let inflation take off becomes a bad thing instead of a good thing. So maybe a little bit more politicization is the way to go. But of course, then you look at someone like Trump and you say, this could, all right-wingers in the U.S. always talk about Venezuela, but who is closest to a Venezuela type print money to support my agenda? And it's actually not people on the right.
Since we're talking about the global economy, I also want to talk to you about what's happening in India and the current debate on how to kickstart growth, which has come to a 6-year low, is whether tax cuts are the most efficient way, or should the government perhaps look at increasing the fiscal deficit a little bit and spend more money and thereby kickstart growth? What do you believe would be the better route?
I don't know enough about the Indian economy to really say, but I will say that just on general experience, tax cuts are way oversold as a way of promoting growth. I mean, we have in the United States, people on the right always talk about the Reagan tax cut, which is, that's now almost 40 years ago. And why don't they talk about more recent successes? And the reason is there aren't any. They've been a disappointment every time, ever since then. So I think the idea that tax cuts are going to be the really stimulative thing is misguided. India does have still some pretty obvious shortfalls in infrastructure. So you would think that it would make more sense to go that route.
Well, yes, that would certainly be an option where we have, in fact, seen public spending and not private sector investment picking up. But Paul Krugman, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us here on CNBC TV 18.
Well, thank you.